Greetings, everyone. I'm still recovering from Rona, but luckily enough we've had some guest narrators come in clutch to help me as I recover, and this is one of those videos from the guest narrator Bathroom Prophet. And as always, I hope that you enjoy.
Terran Soil by Provisional Rebel. The Federation, and by extension the humans, had won the war. Many planets had changed hands. Some systems taken as spoils of war, others being liberated after many long years of occupation. The terms of the treaty were harsh, but why would they be anything else? The Federation were the victors, able to set the terms. Many of the member states made impressive gains, except the humans. Their demands were strange. No one would question their bravery, their courage, and perhaps most of all their insidious guile. But their demands seemed almost timid. That last quality was, of course, what everyone assumed was at play when they asked for small land grants on formerly hostile worlds where their troops had taken part in battles. They wouldn't need to expend energy rebuilding a world's infrastructure and economy when they could just set down military fortifications and become the de facto occupation without the binding legalese. There was some bickering when they also demanded the same allowances on worlds claimed by other federal powers where their troops had fought, but ultimately it was accepted. After all, having human fortress on their worlds would only bolster their ability to keep the newly conquered population in line. The only problem was that no fortresses were ever built. Most enemy worlds under human occupation simply avoided their enigmatic overlords and lived as they always had, while the humans labored away on whatever work they had begun. Some resisted the humans, seemingly just out of the need to show resistance, because they hadn't given them a reason to, but the humans did not crush them, as the other powers would. There were no railgun darts from orbital platforms, no retaliatory strikes. The humans simply informed the world that they were not under occupation, and that their local government was in control, except for the small pieces of land where the humans worked. That was Terran Soil. So life went on. Eventually, the humans completed their work, and all but a handful of troops departed back to their own systems. Eventually, some locals worked up the courage to try and see what the humans had been building all this time. It was underwhelming. Instead of a grand fortress, there was a simple barracks building, and a guardhouse at a gate, in a fenced-off area that stretched almost the entire region the humans had claimed. There was a pair of soldiers at the gate, but they were not the hulking brutes in power armor that fought in the war. They were in dress uniforms, standing out in the open. Still armed with rifles, of course, but even they were different. They looked ancient, with wooden stocks. Behind them, a road leading into the grounds was lined with poles, each bearing a different and often colorful flag. Beyond that, there were only stones, thousands of simple white stones, each equally spaced, their rows perfectly symmetrical, so that each seemed to simply blend into the next.
Asylum by Provisional Rebel. This is a follow-up story to Terran Soil. It is not entirely necessary to read it, but it will definitely give better context to events. Carthissus knew she was going to die, and her body screamed for her to stop, to lay down, to just give up and let them take her, to take her children. She looked down at the baby in her arms as she limped along. He had finally stopped crying. She still felt the weight of her daughter strapped to her back, her breath ragged on her neck from the stress. She brought her senses back to the world around her. The forest was thick, pressing in. She couldn't tell if there was even any noise. Her blood pounded too loudly in her ears to make sense of anything. Suddenly, though, she came out of the trees and froze. She realized where she was. The simple metal fence lay about 50 feet in front of her, and behind it, rows of white stones. It was the humans. She looked right, then left. She'd be exposed if she tried to cross the fence. She should go around. But it was getting dim in the twilight hour. She would be harder to spot. Surely the Theriok wouldn't climb the fence. If they were on her heels, they'd go ask the humans first. She could rest, at least, for a moment. It took almost everything she had to pull them over the edifice. By the time she was on the other side, she had to stop and kneel, out of breath. Once she was kneeling, though, her legs gave out, and she found herself sitting against the fence. Her eyes weakly traced around her surroundings. The stones were silent. It was almost peaceful. She could take a moment to rest. Then the world flared into a bright white light. She clamped her eyes shut against the burning light, and finally she gave in to despair. She just cried, knowing she was at the end now. That she had failed. She held her son tight to her chest as both her children joined in her wails. She heard the human talking, but didn't even register its words. It wasn't until the light dimmed as it moved away that she saw the human was kneeling over her, speaking softly. "Ma'am, are you injured? Can you stand? We have our post nearby. You can sit in there where it's warm and tell us what's going on." She sat there for what seemed like an eternity, frozen, before finally shaking her head. I'm not sure if I can stand." It took several minutes, but with the help of a pair of humans, she was half walked, half carried into a small building by a gate in the fence. The humans sat her down on the couch, then brought her water, which she gulped down quickly. She was still shaking, not quite knowing how this was going to go, but she was hopeful. They hadn't said they were contacting the Theriok. They merely called for a sergeant and a medic who arrived shortly after. The new men walked in a second apart, the first running in with a large bag and giving her a once-over, while the other looked between her and her kids with a strange look on his face. It was difficult to understand the facial features of other species, but it almost looked sad. The man gave a tight smile, barely the smallest lift at the corner of his lips, with his sad eyes. "I'm Sergeant Bigsby. How old are they?" She closed her eyes and lowered her head. He knew the answer, and sighed. "Doc, get her patched up. I have to go talk to the LT." It was a fair amount of time before the man returned, leading a much slimmer man inside. The slim man took a moment to look her over before approaching and kneeling in front of her. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Poe. My sergeant has informed me about the situation." He shot a sideways glance at Bigsby before focusing on the woman. "I need you to think very carefully about this next part. Why did you enter our territory?" She started sobbing, almost silent. She didn't have any more tears to give. The officer spoke again, even softer. "Ma'am, I need to hear you say it." Eventually she choked out as much an answer as she could. "To save them, to escape." The man nodded before standing, just as headlights flashed across the windows and a group of Theriok troops approached the gates. The officer stood a moment later. The Theriok troops were standing just outside the gate now. He lightly placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Please don't run. I'm going to deal with this." Then he stepped out and walked briskly up to the squad of soldiers. The Theriok commander flushed with rage. She could hear the rumble of his voice from outside the shack. He raised a hand and pointed at her through the window. "Thank the gods our satellite finally found her. That criminal has been fleeing for days. It's good that you have caught her, but my men will be taking command of the situation." He waved over his shoulder for his men to move forward. "Drag that lot out here and we can be done." Then it happened, and everyone froze. The human officer had drawn a pistol and had it leveled at his counterpart's head. The Theriok balked before he asked in a flustered voice a little lower than before, "Have you lost your mind, Lieutenant?" The human responded after a moment's pause. His voice was loud but firm and under control. "As per the Charter of the Federation, this is sovereign territory of the United Earth Government. Any attempt to send troops into our territory will be taken as an act of war, and I will defend my command. You and your men are to leave the area." The Theriok pointed through the window at Carthissus and hissed, "She just fled into your territory. She is a resident of this world, and as such is under our authority. You can see the children with your own eyes." "I have granted provisional asylum to this family. They are under our protection. You may seek grievance with the embassy while the request is under review. Now you and your men will leave the area." He stood slack-jawed for a moment, his eyes slowly moving between her and the pistol in the lieutenant's hands. Finally his jaw tightened, and through gritted teeth he spoke in a low voice. "You'll be hearing from my government shortly, Lieutenant." With that he waved his men back, and they stomped away toward their vehicles. The officer kept his pistol trained for a few moments longer as they turned their backs before returning it to its holster. He waited until they had begun to pull away before turning on his heel and addressing one of his men. "Sergeant Bigsby, escort these people to the barracks. See that they're settled into one of the spare rooms while we wait to tell the Theriok government to fuck off." The sergeant snorted for a moment. "I think they already got that memo, sir."
The algorithm reckons you should be watching this video next, and I recommend that you should be always watching my video. So, click with energy! And yes, clicking that does help the channel. Thank you very much. I just want to give a quick thanks to the Tier 5 patrons and channel members. Alithia, Barky, Fudic Yol, Cam Maxwell, Caspar Onholtz, White Van 420, Lord Asrakal, Arcadian, and Oakfield.